And welcome to today's webinar on Software Escrow, a developer's guide to control and continuity. Appreciate you guys making the time. My name is Zayn Afsar, and I will be leading today's session. So we'll be covering a number of different topics today, starting with Software Escrow, an explanation on what it is, who typically uses it, and why. We'll be looking at what should be put into escrow and comparing an on-premise model with a SaaS model and identifying some of the key differences. We'll also be looking at typical scenarios and what options are available and being able to identify which particular option would be most suitable depending on the scenario that you find yourself in. We'll be looking at what makes for an effective escrow contract and addressing some common questions that we receive quite often. We'll also be looking at how much escrow typically costs and who should bear the cost for that as well, before wrapping up today's session with best practices for software developers for escrow. Now, we do also have a Q&A service in place as well. So if you have got any questions throughout the session, please feel free to use that. And I'd be more than happy to either address those questions throughout the presentation or at the end. So firstly, what is software escrow? Software escrow is essentially a risk mitigation tool that operates within a legal agreement and is there to safeguard critical software applications. It's typically a tri-party agreement that works in conjunction with a software license that would be in place between an end user and a developer for a particular software application. And what the escrow agreement ensures is that an escrow agent, whether that be SES or someone else, would receive regular updates of source code at an agreed interval. And this would continue to be the case until either the termination of the agreement because the software license is no longer in place, or a relevant event occurs. So a relevant event in line with the escrow terms, such as ceasing to trade, the developer transferring the IPR, breach of maintenance, some of the typical clauses that could dictate a release of materials. If that was to be the case, the end user would need to provide us with a statutory declaration confirming that a relevant event has occurred. If confirmed, we would be able to release the source code and any additional materials to the end user. Now, we'll be having a look at what those relevant events and the process for a release of escrow looks like further on in the presentation, but that's just a brief overview as to what software escrow is. And from there, you're probably wondering, well, why? Why do we need to have software escrow? There are a couple of main reasons that we typically come across quite often. Firstly, a tick in the box exercise. So this pretty much addresses any compliance, regulatory requirements or needs, maybe a requirement to fulfill a particular contractual obligation. Also, when trying to achieve certain accreditations, then does need to be a demonstration of business continuity or risk mitigation in place. So that's where your compliance comes in. Now, on the flip side, the vast majority of the requirements that we come across are because an end user is looking for continuity in relation to a critical piece of software, and they have concerns that without access to the software, there would be impact on their business operationally, financially, and they need an escrow agreement which provides them with certain assurances or guarantees that what we hold is complete and correct and can be recompiled back into a working application. Now, people tend to have a crossover of requirements. It might be compliance based, but rather than just having a piece of paper in place to say, okay, there is escrow present, they really need to ensure that it's a full, robust continuity solution. So we're able to work with you, as software developers and as end users, to identify what those needs are, what type of coverage is required, and really it comes down to what you guys are hoping to achieve, or what your end users are hoping to achieve with the escrow agreement in place. The third one is something that we're coming across more often as of late, and that's to attract better investment. So in the same way that the escrow facility is there to protect source code for end users, it can also be used to protect technological solution when investors are looking to invest in software. So in this particular scenario, the investor would essentially act as the licensee or the beneficiary. And what that allows them to do is have continued access to source code documentation, and other key materials should a relevant event occur and the developer no longer be in the position to support or maintain. Seen more as a positive rather than sort of a negative or a strength rather than a weakness, if you like. It shows foresight, it shows commitment to a long-term relationship, and it's something that more and more people are looking for these days. Now, why is escrow important to you guys as software developers? As I mentioned there, it shows foresight, it shows long-term commitment and planning, and really builds the foundations for a long-term relationship with trust. Off the back of that, it also offers a competitive advantage. I've been having many conversations with end users, and with continuity becoming more and more prevalent, and an ever increasing requirement, one standout in terms of suppliers when end users are looking for software, especially if it's a case of a like for like system, would be the inclusion of continuity as an additional service when onboarding with software. Um, and really that holds them in good stead moving forward. Many software developers that we work with have also been able to leverage escrow and turn it into an additional revenue stream. So although we will talk about pricing a little bit later on, they've been able to make use of one of our multi-framework agreements, whereby we would charge them one set fee for the setup of the agreement and then an annual fee per end user. They take the costs, add their own markup, and then charge their client separately. So whilst this can be important for end users, I think we're demonstrating here it can also be important to use, not necessarily just to make an additional revenue stream, but things such as being able to provide a unique selling point, having a competitive advantage over competitors, building long-term trust, as well as potentially benefiting financially as well. So there's plenty of different avenues we can look at and plenty of different benefits. One of the key benefits in terms of being proactive with escrow is being more in control of the terms of the contract. Now, we're able to sort of offer a service here where the process is quite simple and straightforward. However, what we do tend to find is reviewing terms for each and every requirement for a specific application tends to be the most time-consuming aspect of the process. If you were looking to be proactive and set in place a framework agreement that your customers could sign on to as they onboard, then we tend to have a lot less pushback on those terms. There'd be less time actually reviewing the terms and more a case of providing that facility to your customers. Here's the escrow facility in place. Here are the terms. Are you happy to be registered to the agreement? Yes or no? Saves everyone a bit more time. Saves you guys a bit more money as well. As I mentioned, it attracts better investors and venture capitalists if that's something that you're looking for or potentially exploring moving forward. And also, you have the ability to have independent access and a copy of your source code independently stored. So whilst escrow agreements are typically tri-party agreements, we do have also in place what we call holding agreements and development agreements that software developers use to ensure that they can always access their source code and build guide information independently, particularly useful for not necessarily just one-man bands, but maybe instances where a company has an increased amount of knowledge shared between a small amount of personnel, maybe your software development team, whatever the case may be. And I'm sure you guys know what it's like, people moving on internally, externally. So it's a good way to protect source code, protect that knowledge base for whether it be the short, medium, or long term as well. So why is it important to your end users? A lot more apparent and straightforward. They're looking to guarantee continuation of key software. They want to make sure that they've got assurances in place that if something did happen to the developer, that they can continue using the system as normal. And as we mentioned previously, it does also address regulatory and compliance requirements such as ISO 27001, which is Information Security Management Standard, and DORA when it comes to stressed exit planning and third-party risk management as well. Release events. So we did discuss at the start what a typical escrow model looks like. The release events within the escrow agreement are the terms that would dictate what would cause a release of the deposited materials. Now, Typically, these tend to be things such as transfer of IPR. So if there is a transfer of IPR and the new owner is not offering a like-for-like service or has considerably increased prices, that could be a cause for a release event. We do also have breach of maintenance, um, ceasing to trade, and liquidation, receivership, or administration. Now, these are the typical standard terms that we have in place as our release mechanisms. As I mentioned, being proactive does tend to work in your favor. With us being a privately owned company, we're also very flexible in the terms that we offer. So we're happy for any type of amendments to be made to wording or clauses, as long as it doesn't materially impact the rest of the agreement. So getting ahead of the curve, setting the terms can be super, super beneficial for those that do want escrow in place. And if we do ever find ourselves in a situation where we've got a multi-framework agreement and one of your customers looking to have continuity for whatever reason isn't happy with the terms, we can always address that and set up a separate individual agreement if need be. But as I mentioned, we very rarely tend to find any type of pushback for customers joining agreements that have already been in place historically or recently set up. So with regards to the release of materials, in terms of the process, when an end user becomes aware of a relevant event having occurred, they have 14 days to confirm, they have up to 30 days to make us aware of a relevant event by submitting a signed declaration, which is included within the agreement. So it's a very simple, straightforward process. The developer has up to 14 days to confirm or deny. As it mentions there, that can be negotiated at the start, obviously before the agreement is set up. Now, if the developer, for whatever reason, does not come back to us within 14 days to confirm or deny the relevant event, then the materials are released. If the developers come back to us at any point to confirm that a relevant event has occurred, at that point, we will approve and release the materials. If the developer comes back and denies the relevant event, that's when it will enter a dispute resolution, something, once again, that we don't tend to come across too often. Now, we saw this model at the start of the presentation. It is very much catered towards a typical on-prem solution. Now, on-prem software is installed on the customer's infrastructure, and as I mentioned, the source code is held in escrow. In this type of instance, if there was a disruption event, because the system is installed on site on the customer's infrastructure, the system would still be accessible the next day. Where you come across with issues is in terms of ongoing maintenance and support, whether it be bug fixes, updates in terms of additional functionalities. And that's where the value of Software Escrow really comes into play, especially if you want continued access to the software. We would also recommend our code validation test to ensure that everything that we hold in escrow is what you would require to successfully rebuild and redeploy the software for long-term use. Now, the way in which this differs from a SaaS model. So with cloud-based solutions, the software is delivered to the end user via the cloud. So it would be hosted in an environment such as AWS, GCP, or Azure. And with the ongoing digital transformation, more and more solutions, the vast majority of the requirements we get now are for SaaS applications, which kind of defeats the sort of old myth or misconception that you can't do escrow for SaaS software. You certainly can. The risk is increased as well because in a supplier disruption event, with the application being hosted via the cloud, there would be an instant loss to the system, as well as potentially the data included within the application as well. So it's really, really important to understand why you want escrow in place and also the implications of not having access to the system. So when reviewing escrow, typically it's best to understand whether it's an on-prem solution and whether it's a SaaS solution, and that would give us a basic understanding in terms of which template agreement would be required. But beyond that, it's really important to understand how critical the system is and what it is you're hoping to achieve with the escrow. In terms of the process, very similar. The application is hosted and access provided to the end user. With our SaaS service, as well as source code, we're able to take data. So if you don't have independent access to data, that's important for us to store as well. Virtual machines, and essentially any other materials required for a successful rebuild and redeployment of the software should the escrow be called upon. Now, with traditional software escrow, at the point of us releasing the materials to the end user, the responsibility in terms of getting the system back up and running would rely with the end user. We're in a position, if the validation testing has been done, to provide them with all the information that they would need for a successful rebuild and redeployment exercise. But at the point in which the materials are released, that's when our responsibility would, in effect, come to an end. Off of the back of that, we've had quite extensive conversations and feedback with clients over the years to a point where we have now launched our top end flagship product, if you like, which really goes or which was really in place to bridge the gap between business continuity and disaster recovery. So with this, SES would have a replica or a warm standby version of the application in our own external environment. And we would essentially be able to provide you guys with instant or almost instant access to the software if a disruption event occurs. So the important aspect to consider here is the recovery time objective. If a system is important, but you can make do, bearing in mind with what we've discussed in terms of the release of materials process, if you can do without the system potentially for a week to 2 weeks, plus the time to get the system back up and running, software escrow would do exactly what you need it to do, whilst keeping those elements of risk to an absolute minimum. However, if you have a mission critical system in place where, so if you didn't have access to the system for a day or 2 days or 3 days, would have detrimental impacts on the business, that's really where SaaS continuity comes in to bridge that gap in the immediate short term. It also works similarly to our standard escrow agreements in the way that we'll release the build guide information, the source code, and any additional materials to the end user, typically for a period of 90 days, although that can be negotiated to be shortened or extended. And in the background, in the meantime, work can be done for the long-term use and viability of the software. Because as I mentioned, we would not be able to stand this up indefinitely. We can do for an interim period. But what this does is protect you guys in the immediate short term when it comes to losses of business and mission critical systems. Now, just a few bits of stats here for you guys. So around 75% of SES ESCO contracts are for third-party software, but we do also deal with different types of requirements, and we're very bespoke in the way that we work. So we also deal and handle software that's being developed internally. As I mentioned, development contracts we can deal with. Software owned by a company but supported or developed externally. So if you own the IP for a particular piece of software, but you're using an external developer to build the software for you. That's a way. That's a typical scenario of where our holding agreement to protect the IP and the build guide information would come in useful. IP transfers, as we mentioned, software, company mergers, blueprints, schematics, engineering drawings. We do deal with quite an extensive array of requirements. So if there are any sort of requirements that differ slightly from typical software escrow, please feel free to get in touch and we'll be happy to advise accordingly. So some common questions. How is escrow tested to ensure that the beneficiary can actually make use of it? So I mentioned validation testing briefly so far. So this is our extensive way of ensuring that what we hold from the developer is complete and correct, and that it can also be recompiled back into the working application with full functionality. The involvement from the perspective of end users is quite minimal. We would typically engage in a scoping call to ensure that everyone's aware of the process and what it is that we're trying to achieve. And we would set aside one full day typically with someone from the software developers development site to witness a rebuild taking place. And we would then go away and put together some reporting to demonstrate exactly how that step-by-step process was achieved. Sorry, I was just getting distracted then by a question that's come through. So we've had a question asking how long does a validation take and how often should it be done? Very good question. So as I was mentioning there, actually, we set aside one full day with the developer to witness a rebuild taking place. Depending on the system itself, we don't necessarily always need that time, but we set aside one day. And then typically we would set aside 5 days thereafter for our validation consultant to put together the reporting. And what the beneficiary would benefit from is, as it says there, an independent report, which includes the bill guide information, complete with video and audio. And that would also be deposited in escrow along with the source code. So what they would receive is a report verifying that what we hold is complete and correct, that essentially it passed. They would only have access to the bill guide information and the relevant reporting if a relevant event occurred and we were in a position to release the materials. So another common question, what level of escrow does a software developer and or their customer need? Now, as I mentioned previously, it all depends on what is the objective, what you guys and your end user or the end user is trying to achieve. Things to consider, how critical the software is to the business operations, what the exit strategy would be. So if we release the materials to you tomorrow, do you have the in-house personnel to get the system back up and running? Would it need to be outsourced externally? How much value can the validation exercise provide in ensuring continuity, if continuity would be the objective? If, as we've also previously mentioned, it's a tick in the box exercise, then at that point, validation isn't really part of the conversation. So yeah, what is it that you guys are looking to achieve? How critical is the software? And if it is critical and you want continuity, what is the recovery time objective? How long can you realistically go without the system? And that will give us a very good indication as to whether a traditional software escrow agreement with validation is what we would need, or whether we would need to look at something like our SaaS continuity. So yeah, a simplified way to look at that is what you need the escrow facility to do. Do you need an escrow agent to act simply as a repository? Is it a tick in the box exercise to say that an escrow agreement exists, but there isn't a requirement for any type of additional validation testing or proof that it does what it needs it to do? If that's the case, a standard escrow agreement is all we would need. If continuity is important and you can do without the system for a period of potentially 1 to 2 to 3 weeks, an escrow agreement with validation would do exactly what you need it to do, and we'd ensure that everything we hold can successfully result in a rebuild of the application with full functionality. If the recovery time objective is key and you would need almost instant access to the system in a disruption event, then at that point, really, our full SaaS continuity system is what we would strongly recommend. Now, we do have standard terms for a number of our agreements, so individual agreements, if it's a simple tri-party escrow agreement, the master SaaS, which is our framework agreement, which I mentioned, that can be implemented to benefit a number of end users under one contract, and also our SaaS continuity agreement. So if there is interest from anyone in receiving a copy of any of the agreements, you can always get in touch and make a request, and we'd be more than happy to provide those for you. So what makes an escrow contract effective? As I've said, it really depends on what it is that you're hoping to achieve. And from there, we can understand what needs to be included and what doesn't need to be included. So essentially, what's important for all escrow contracts to be effective is for people to be aware of their rights and the responsibilities. So for the developer or the licensor, the responsibility to deposit escrow materials and at an agreed frequency to make sure that those are appropriately updated. SES, in terms of managing the process and making sure that any deposits have the right level of testing and validation included, and that we're keeping you guys up to date at all times whilst the agreement is live. And also the beneficiary's responsibility in terms of the release process. So we tend to be quite active in making sure that we've got the correct contacts and conducting account summaries on an annual basis, making sure everyone, all the parties to the agreement are happy. Um, but yeah, it's the responsibility in terms of making us aware of a relevant event and following the process lies with the beneficiaries. And obviously, if there are any questions from any parties at any point, we're always more than happy to assist when we can. In terms of what needs to be included for an escrow contract to be effective, it's whatever we would need to have a successful rebuild of the application. So naturally, with a solution that's on-prem, it would typically just be source code. With SaaS, we take data, we take virtual machines, and any type of build script, source code, configuration, API data. Like I said, if we just need to act as a repository for the code to demonstrate that a form of risk mitigation or continuity is in place, that's fine. If it's more so for continuity, anything that would be required for a successful rebuild, we would hold and release under the escrow terms. So who should pay for an escrow solution? Now, we have plenty of examples of both the developer the developer or the end user paying for the escrow agreement. Typically, it tends to be the end user, but in those examples, it's normally the end user that have approached SES or an escrow agent to facilitate an escrow solution for a particular application. We're not too precious on who pays. I mean, if you're proactive with getting an escrow agreement in place, we can happily talk you through the options in terms of what we would think would be the best solution. And how you choose to approach it or to implement it is down to you. I mean, do you want to use the escrow as part of contractual negotiations? Do you want to have something in place for customers to sign on to? Are you happy for them to pay us directly? Would you want us to charge you and for you guys to charge your customers with or without a markup? So those are all things to consider. We're quite open and transparent. We're happy for you to proceed in a way that you're most comfortable with. But to answer the question in short, either party can pay for the escrow. We wouldn't be too precious on that either way. So some of the key takeaways from today's session. So I think it's important to try and understand what you're looking for and what type of solution is required and how you want the control to lie. So typically, what do you want from the escrow terms? Are you happy for the customer to dictate the terms and have input and then come back to you? This tends to be more sort of prevalent for those developers that don't tend to come across software escrow too often, or aren't necessarily too bothered about turning it into an additional revenue stream. They're more so reactive and will address escrow as of when it comes up. That's perfectly fine. If it tends to crop up quite often, at that point, I would certainly recommend looking to put in place a framework agreement, which makes it a much easier and simpler process when those conversations do pop up. So how is the software delivered, whether it's on-prem, a cloud-based solution, that will help you to identify what type of agreement is needed and what the recovery time objective for the customer is. That will help us to identify, first of all, whether continuity is required. If they're talking about recovery time objective, I'm assuming it is, and what level of service would be the most suitable, given the risk of potentially being with or without a key piece of software for up to 1 or 2 weeks. By being proactive, you've got more control to decide what the key release events should be. You've got control over who should pay for the escrow solution. So as I've said, anyone that's onboarding on to an escrow agreement that's already in place, we can already have the facility in place to provide them with the most recent deposit report, the terms that have already been agreed and fixed upon prior to them onboarding. Finances the annual fee. So that can be done by your customer or by yourself to then pass on the costs. Now, I appreciate that we've covered quite a lot over today's session. I have got one more question, but I believe we are also coming towards the end of the presentation. So just to wrap this up, we have got a number of operational resilience documents on our key services, as well as the validation testing options as well. So if there are any requirements or any interest in receiving any of the appropriate documentation, please do get in touch. I've also got my email and contact number on screen. More than happy to set up any calls or liaise over email to discuss anything from today's session or any other requirements that you'd be wanting to discuss. If there are any other questions, I'll be more than happy to answer them. The other one that came in just before was to do with what we should look for when sourcing an escrow supplier. So a very good question. Due diligence and research, I would definitely recommend. The typical software escrow agreement or licensing agreement, depending on if it's, for short-term use or long-term use, you could be looking at 5 to 7 years. So I think longevity is important. Escrow agents who have had the experience of being able to go through a full cycle of a software escrow agreement. So being able to deal with relevant events occurring, the process, company obviously that is reputable, has the necessary security standards in place, such as ISO 9001, 27001, whether those are UCAS accredited or self-certified, I think are all important aspects that need to be considered when looking at a software escrow agent. And I think that would give you a great idea as to whether they're the kind of company that you'd want to work with, or whether you might see another company being a better fit for you going forward. I don't think there's any other questions for the time being. Let's have a quick look. No, it's just those two. So that does bring today's session to an end. So I do appreciate the time made for everyone who's joined today's session. The presentation that I've given today is a shorter form. There is also a longer version of the presentation with more information on there. So I will be sharing those with everyone who's registered today. And hopefully I'll be having conversations with you guys moving forward. So please feel free to get in touch. Hope today's been useful for you, and it's been a pleasure delivering the presentation as well. Thank you very much.